Anything with ours?
Hello, this is the F101 Foundations of Change, our first class in the Force Management curriculum. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Chris Hughes, and I'm here with
Mr. Jim Kennedy.
at Fort Belvoir Command General Staff College, Team 29. And today we're just going to be going over some slides to introduce how the Army begins its change process. All right, so here's our learning objectives. You see some of the ELOs there at the bottom. We're going to discuss Title 10. We're going to talk about certain organizations that help execute the Title 10 process. We'll look at some strategic documents, talk a little bit about organizational change, and also look at the Army's framework for developing and promulgating its vision. And please remember, through all these classes, that a good Army is like a good mullet. You don't grow one overnight. All right, so this is the force management model. So when we go through these classes, this is the model that we're actually going to be using. So starting with determining strategic and operational requirements. So that's our F101 class. Is what we're talking about right now. We're really saying what are the things that the Army must accomplish and what are its requirements. That then drops down into develop capabilities, because sometimes we may be asked to do something that we don't have the capability to do. So looking through the .mil PFP domains, we come up with solutions to be able to fill any capability gaps that we find after looking at strategic operational requirements. So that is F102. Then we move into F103 Alpha, where we're actually going to look at designing some organizations, developing that TOE, the Table of Organization and Equipment, and then going into 103 Bravo, we're going to look at determining authorizations. So in 103 Alpha, we'll also look at total Army analysis and how we find the right mix of forces. And then in 103 Bravo, we'll look at the PPPE process, the planning, programming, budgeting, execution process, which helps us get the resources we need to build those organizations. Then we'll go into F104, the material acquisition management process, the defense acquisition system, talk about either buying or building new pieces of equipment to fill those capability gaps, focusing on material solutions. And then we'll go into 105, which is where we're going to integrate those personnel where we built in F103 and the equipment that we built in F104 into the units to make it a trained and ready unit for COCOM commanders to use and abuse through the SRP process, the Statement Readiness process. So we'll talk about all those in future classes, but that is the model we're going to use throughout this entire curriculum. And there are the course titles for each of those blocks. All right, so starting off today's class, talking about Title 10. So in Title 10 gives us the authority to do what we need to do to exist. The Constitution says that we will have an Army, but Title 10 kind of says, okay, what does that look like, and how are we going to execute the functions that the Army needs to function? Specifically, it gives the Secretary of the Army, it gives the Secretary of the Army the authority to be able to do these 12 things. So recruit, organize, supply, equip, so on and so forth, to be able to make the Army capable, but it also reduces the number of people that are on the R staff. So the next thing we're going to look at is say, how does the Secretary of the Army actually execute all these functions he's responsible for? And this is how it's done. So if Title 10 reduces the amount of people that can be on the R staff, we need to have other organizations that help us execute those Title 10 functions. So of course, the White House, we have our overall strategic guidance from the President. We have Congress, who gives us our budget and gives us oversight. And then we have the Office of Secretary of Defense there at the Pentagon, who's also setting direction and policy along with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then, of course, under them, they have the combat commanders that are C2ing our forces at the geographic commands. So we have the Army Secretariat, Secretary of the Army, who we just said Title 10 says these are the 12 things that you must do for the Army. And then he has the R staff to be able to help him do those things. But since Title 10 reduces the number of people on our staff, we also have field operating agencies and direct reporting units. So field operating agencies report directly to the R staff and assist them with executing Title 10 functions. So an example of that would be like HRC, Human Resources Command. And then you have the direct reporting unit, who also helps the R staff execute its Title 10 functions, but reports directly to the Chief of Staff of the Army. Has their own budget, and they have specific institutional roles like the War College or MedCom. And we'll discuss those more in our class, but just have an understanding of what they exist and why they exist. Then, of course, you have the three major Army commands, which is Army Material Command, FORCECOM, and TRADOC. And then you have the ASCCs that fall underneath each of the COCOMs. So an example of that, like for CENTCOM, you have RCENT, and for AFRICOM, you have United States Army Africa, things of that nature.
All right, so the Army plan. So how does the Army take these documents that, if you're in CGSC, you learned about in your C200 classes, National Security Strategy, the Defense Strategy, the QDR, and the National Military Strategy. How do we take those and do our Army plan and change the Army to the future so that we can grow our good Army, our good mullet? Well, what we have to do is we have to take these documents and look at them through a Title 10 lens. What have we been told to do? What are our roles and missions as an Army? And how are we going to train, man, equip, sustain, station those different forces in order to meet the missions that are set forth in these joint documents? Well, once we've looked at those and pulled out all the mission statements and implied specified tasks and structure that we need to have to meet these documents, the Secretary and the Chief write a vision. The current one is out. I'll show you a slide on that in just a minute. Part of that is for the reading. It's about 35 pages long. It's a nice little document. It lays out our plan for the far future. What's our Army going to look like in 20, 30 years, and where do we need to go? We do that about, that looks 10, 20 years out. They'll do that maybe every chief, every new secretary. It's possible we may have a new one here with the new administration, with a new secretary and a new chief. Then we look into strategy. So this is just bones here on the vision. Strategy is every couple years. That's done by the G357, where they look at how do we go from that vision to where we want to go to. So they'll look at big things such as we're going to conduct certain exercises, certain partnership with other countries. They're trying to get about to the 10-year horizon. But those are more specific. So starting to put the sinews or the tendons on this. Then we get to the planning this every 2 years. What are we going to do? We will participate in Exercise Atlantic Resolve. We will participate in Operation Spartan Shield. We will conduct certain exercises. We'll do one brigade a year to the NTC or whatever it is that we put out for training. The G8 is responsible for that, because that looks at resources. What are we going to have? Then we have the programming guidance. It's done every year, but it looks out 7 years. What guidance do we need to do so that we can figure out how much this is going to cost so that we can go to Congress to get the money for the people, the material, the training, the modernization that we want to be able to accomplish? And then in Section 5, because we are an orders-based organization, every year we put out an Army campaign plan. Now, interestingly, they haven't done one in the last couple of years, but it is the order that tells all the organizations what to do.
It's very important that when you look at these documents and Title 10 that you not be in a situation where you can cause harm to other people by falling asleep. These are not documents that are going to keep you up at night, but if you do not respond to strong sleeping drugs, we do recommend reading either one of them, and they'll take care of that.
All right, so here's the Army vision that's put out by Secretary Ordinaro. This is back in May of 15. He and the Secretary signed at that point. But if you look, we just went through the first couple pages and look at the bold highlighted sections that are out there. This is what we're trying to get to: a total force. That's active guard, reserve, and civilians. Some people even include our contracted support workforce in operation as part of that. So what are we going to look? It's got to be balanced and versatile, as well as scalable. What does that mean? It doesn't look like today. What's it going to look like in 5, 10, 20 years? Rapidly changing. We've got to evolve. You've got to have more innovation, changing our fighting formations. Got to increase modularity. They're even looking at modularity below the combat brigade level. Prioritize and change. This is the focus of the Army's future, looking out. This is what the R Staff does. The R Staff doesn't fight today's battles. The R Staff prepares us to fight and be ready for the future.
All right, so thinking of the future, also looking back in the past. So we look at these, a lot of people's first thought is the Fulda Gap. This is the way that we're going to fight the Russians from Germany as we're coming across. This is when we knew the platoon leader that was in the tank that was facing us, and they knew who we were. But, of course, that's the way that it was. It's no longer the way that it is. This is more appropriate for today's battlefield. So you can see there's a lot more complexity to the battlefield. We have a lot more capabilities, but sometimes those capabilities can also become challenges in themselves. But to win in a complex world, we have to have a greater understanding of the area, and that's really the cornerstone of unified land operations.
Yeah, this is the product I grew up in, an airland battle. Everything was known. We knew what the Soviets had. We knew where they were. They knew us. It was very simple, confined to certain areas type places. Today, we don't know what the enemy's going to have. We don't know what capabilities they're going to do. We don't know who they are. They're non-state actors. Some are state actors. We don't know what their intentions are. They're as much capable as we are in some cities or in some capabilities. So it's a much more complex environment than the fairly easy, straightforward air-land battle Cold War.
So it really comes down to the different capabilities that it took to win in each of those environments. So back in the 1970s to today, using the big five, as we called them, so the M1, the UH-60, the AH-64, the Patriot, and the M2 to be able to close and defeat the enemy. But in today's battlefield, so from today onward, really, it's more complex and we need a different set of capabilities. So the big five have changed. So now we need capabilities to overmatch. We need to be able to not only meet our enemies on the battlefield, but we need to have overmatch to be able to defeat them. We need to have optimized soldiers and team performance. So the individual is a lot more important. So the training we put into our soldiers to be able to let them act autonomously, to exercise mission command is more important. Joint interoperability, that is a huge one. We need to not only be able to work with the other services, but also with our other partners inside the government. So intelligence agencies, our multinational partners, NATO, things of that nature. So that interoperability is very important. We need to have scalable and tailorable combined armed forces teams. So we need to be able to match the mission with our forces. So we don't want to go too heavy, we don't want to go too light. So we need to be scalable and tailorable. Then of course the adaptive professionals and institutions, again, to really make sure our soldiers are able to execute on the battlefield the guidance that they are given. So those are the things that are necessary today to be able to be successful on the battlefield and in the future.
All right, so how are we going to get there? Once we have the Army plan, that sets us out on a course. But TRADOT puts out every once in a while, and the last one was in October of 14, it was rolled out at AUSA, is the Army's operating concept. And it takes a look at the joint operating concept, or the capstone concept for joint operations, is what they call it, CCJO. And look at the Army's capstone concept. But the Army, this tells us what we're going to be able to need to do and how we're going to do it for 2020 to 2040. This is not doctrine, but it drives us to new organizations, new training, new capabilities that are going to be then tested, evaluated through simulations and exercises to become new doctrine. So you'll read, I would recommend you read part of this, at least chapter 1 and chapter appendix B-2 that talks about the 20 warfighting challenges, the things that we have to be able to do in the future. We'll get more into this in the F102 in the next class.
These are the type of documents that kind of give you the so what behind the things the Army's doing. So you may not understand, well, why are we doing this or why are we not doing this? So having an understanding of the Army vision and the Army operating concept will be able to help you answer those questions for your soldiers when they come to you and say, sir, ma'am, why are we doing this?
So when we look at building an organization in the future for change, for whatever it is, those things that the chief laid out in the vision, we have what's called the Army Organizational Life Cycle Model. We have one for personnel too. It's slightly, the names on the different domains are slightly different. And we have a model for acquisition of material. But when we look at an organization, we're like, okay, when something happens, we need to develop a new capability. And you can see the spider web that's in the middle here. It means all these different activities are interlinked and can be skipped. We look at buying a new organization or buying a new material. We have to acquire it. We didn't have to train on it. We distribute out to the organizations, by the requirements. We always need resources, influences this. Then we deploy it to where it's going to be needed, be that a humanitarian, disaster relief, an operational requirement, combat zone, stability, partnership for peace training. We have to sustain it continually. We have to plan for it. We have to plan to make it better. We have to plan to make students better. Soldiers and officers through schooling. We make equipment better through material improvements. And then we have to plan on releasing it, separating you from the Army, retirement, just regular attrition, or just getting rid of the equipment through
foreign military sales,
foreign military
turning
sales
into DLA for demilling.
It's called divestiture. But as the ideal plan is, as you start buying a new material like the JLTV that we're in the process of buying, as you're developing the acquisition plan to buy it, you're thinking, what's the training plan going to be? What organizations are they going to be on as far as the MTOs? How's it going to be used in an operational environment? How are we going to sustain it? What's going to be the plan for parts, training of mechanics? What type of fuel? How are we going to make it better in the future? 5 years, 10 years, is that planned? And then in 30 years, what's the plan to get rid of the JLTV? Not what's going to replace it, but what's the plan to get rid of it? Can we set something we can sell to foreign governments? Is that something we can give over to civilian law enforcement or civilian or U.S. government organizations? Or is it something we can't dispose of? We had to store it in the M1 tank. We can't just sell those or anything. We had to send them out to Sierra Army Depot and park them in the desert. But sometimes you have something like the MRAP that was a rapid acquisition where we bought it. We didn't put much thought into the training plan or distribution what MTOs it was going to be on. It was buy them, fly them over to Iraq and Afghanistan. We put no thought into sustainment or separation or development. It was just buy them and deploy them and use them. After we did that, we came back with a training plan. We're now putting them on certain MTOs and organizations. We developed a sustainment plan for the ones we're going to keep. We know how we're going to make those we're going to keep better, and we are separating. We know what we're going to do and when to get rid of them. So we re-engineered this whole process after the fact because the most important thing was saving soldiers' lives. So what are we doing with managing strategic risks? This is always a question that students have is, well, what if we need this in the future? Well, about 4 years ago, the chief put out the concept of reversibility and expansibility. So as we're drawing down the Army to whatever goal that is, they just passed the ND 2017 NDAA, so I haven't looked to see what the force structure is going to be. But as we're drawing down and restructuring, we have to brief, this Army staff has to brief the chief as we draw down what are the abilities to reverse what we're doing and what is the impact if we have to expand. Because this red thing here is the enemy gets a vote. So if we have to expand and build 8 BCTs at 15,000 people a year, as we change a brigade, as we close a headquarters, as we restation somebody, as we take out certain capabilities within the force with MOSs or reduce them, what is the impact on our ability to reverse that decision and expand the Army to grow 8 more brigades rapidly if we need to? So that is a thought process, but that's what the bosses and the strategic leaders get paid to do, is manage that risk that we're assuming the farther down the path we go.
Okay, so we talk a lot in this course about OpCon and TACON, and then we have AdCon, and some people get very confused about AdCon, so let's take a second here to understand what AdCon means. So while our forces are in CONUS, when they're there in the continental United States or in other places, but if you're in the continental United States, you belong to FORSCOM. So for stationing purposes, all the brigades belong to FORSCOM. FORSCOM attaches them to some of the divisions out there. So in our example here, we have 10th Mountain down there at Fort Polk. So 10th Mountain now has responsibility for their brigades for training and readiness oversight, as well as manning, equipping, sustaining, development, and deployment. So that's what 10th Mountain has responsibility for. But if there's some reason that they need to deploy, FORSCOM will then attach them to EUCOM, in our example here being in the GATS scenario, which you'll be familiar with later on in the C500 class. So FORSCOM has taken that brigade from 10th Mountain Division, attached them to EUCOM. So now they are OpCon to the Combined Joint Task Force for the mission, so whatever that is there in the GATS scenario, but they are AdCon to the United States Army Europe. The ASCC, the Army Service Component Command of the Geographic Command, the COCOM, which in this scenario is EUCOM. So the ASCC is United States Army Europe. They will handle all Title 10 responsibilities for that brigade. Since EUCOM, of course, it's joint, so it's got all the services in it. So that ASCC underneath EUCOM will handle the Title 10 responsibilities for the Army, because it is the Army's responsibility under Title 10 to do the manning, equipping, sustaining, readiness, and deployment for that unit. The Air Force can't do it, the Navy can't do it, so it's the Army's responsibility. So that's why the ASCC has that responsibility while that brigade is attached to EUCOM.
Yeah. Just as an example, when the brigade's back at Fort Polk, they order their supply parts, all the repair parts and supplies. That comes through FORSCOM. But when they deploy over here and they need repair parts, they order those parts through USARA. USARA does all the feeding. USARA gets all the fuel. That's what we're talking about. That's what the requirements change and the responsibilities change for administrative control.
Okay, so operating force versus generating force. Those are the two forces that make up our total Army force. So operating force being those units that are out there deploying, actually, fighting the enemy, and then you have the generating force, the ones that are back here in CONUS supporting the operating force through different means, which we'll talk about more in depth in class. But the generating force can also deploy. It takes Headquarters DA G357 to approve them to deploy, but examples of this would be like the old Guard that deployed to OIF and OEF. 11th ACR out of the National Training Center, they deployed to OIF and OEF. So it is possible for pieces of the generating force with approval of G357 to deploy just like the operating forces do. All right, and those are just the highlights of the class for F101, which we get more in depth in topics in class, but that's just a general overview. So we talked about Congress's role in executing Title 10, so the budget and the oversight piece. Department of the Army accomplishing its responsibilities through Title 10 using the field operating agencies, direct reporting units, and the 3 Army major commands. We talked about ADCON and the Title 10 responsibilities the ASCC provides. Mr. Kenny talked about the purpose of the Army Organizational Life Cycle Model to capture the continuous cycle of force management. He talked about the 5 parts of the Army Plan, focusing a little bit on the vision there. The national strategy documents that are inputs into Army Force Management. So those are the National Security Strategy, the National Military Strategy, the QDR, things of that nature, which you taught more about in your C200 classes. And then the 2 forces that the Army consists of, the generating force and the operating force, and that it's G357 that must approve a deployment of the generating force to a combat theater. And so that's it for F101, and we'll now move to F102.
That's right.